Hi everyone, welcome to the presentation. We'll be talking about Western Europe after 476, which was essentially when the Roman Empire collapsed. So use your knowledge from our activity in class or simulation to help you as you go through this. There aren't any notes specifically to take, but there are points where there's going to be questions that are going to pop up for you to answer. So make sure that when you see those questions, that you pause the video and you answer those questions, and those will give me an indication that A, you've watched, and B, that you're understanding the material that we cover. So we'll talk a lot about the development and spread of Christianity as we begin to look at religion within the course of our unit. So where do we leave off? We left off from our last unit looking at Roman Empire at its height, about 200 CE. And you can see this donut shape of really all this red is what we see here of what they were able to conquer. You can see, Greece and stuff here, those were separate until later on. And so we can see here a lot of territory, this expansive empire that the Romans were able to build. Really at the crux of their empire was a good chunk of Europe, even with all the other ones during this time. And as we talked about, this great expansion, this large empire, was really the Achilles heel and the irony of what made them collapse and fall. So, as you mentioned, Odoacer came. He was a barbarian, a Germanic barbarian who came and invaded and helped to destroy this Roman Empire and take it down. And the question becomes, now that we have the fall of the Roman Empire, is three major questions. What will happen to Christianity as it was just in its infancy at the time? What will happen to Roman government and law? Will it stay in place? Will it be shifted? Will it be gone entirely? What will happen? And also, what will happen to the cultural unity in Europe? As you can see from the map, this is a quite expansive and inclusive piece of Europe, all the way from, Western Europe, all the way into Mesopotamia, going into in the Middle East here, in that space as well. And so what we see is what is going to become of this cultural unity within Europe, as we know about what empires can do. And will it stay? Will it shift? What's going to happen now as a result of this breakup? So let's first mention the changing face within Christianity, that we see three shifts. We see Christianity under Jesus, under Paul, and then in a moment we'll talk about under Constantine. When Christianity was really just starting to begin, really wasn't anything, was really under Jesus and the vision that Jesus had for the religion in itself. When Jesus was alive, and really not until several years after his death, do we really see anything resembling this idea of creating it into a formal religion. But under Jesus, there was no such thing as Christianity. It was purely a reinterpretation of Judaism, as we know Jesus was Jewish. And so it's important to remember that his vision was really just to be an interpretation of Judaism, not something entirely separate. It was mostly rejected, though, by society. Only really a small sect of the population, Jesus, 12 of his disciples, and a few others, including Paul, believed in these philosophies and believed that this was really the best approach in how to bring about Christianity. The focus was not only on adhering to the Old Testament, but also on spirituality, on your spiritual health, and focusing on your ability to be a very spiritual person rather than on the physical conditions of who you are, and what the requirements are within that for you as a Christian individual. Later on down the road, we see an apostle named Paul who followed Jesus' teachings, but believed that the law was not as important as Jesus' teachings. And what Jesus set out was important, but he also had his own shift in thinking and how it should work. Under Paul, Christianity got a lot bigger. It wasn't a major faith yet. It was only 10% of the Roman Empire, but still was a growing piece and a growing thought during this time. Unlike Jesus, he believed in a much stricter interpretation of Jewish beliefs and also fought for these beliefs against persecution and martyrdom, this idea that you fight for what you believe in and you sacrifice yourself, your physical being, in order to have, for the commonwealth and the common good of this faith. So these are some minor shifts that we see within these two. Christianity under Constantine and thereafter, we see a greater shift. When the Roman Empire fell, Constantine took over. And he decided that Christianity was going to become this main this main framework of religion within this territory within Europe. And so as the bureaucracy fell, Catholic bishops, these higher up clergymen within the hierarchy of Christianity, started to take leadership roles within cities. It wasn't government leadership anymore; it was now religious leadership. So they'd be spiritual leaders, they'd be in charge of the water systems and commerce, and sort of the all day-to-day activities of the proper efficiency and functioning of the society. And eventually, bishops in 5 cities became the most prominent. These called these patriarchs. We see them in Alexandria, in Jerusalem, Antioch, and Constantinople, which these are in Turkey, Rome. And so we see these 5 major patriarchs becoming sort of the guiding framework for what Christianity should look like. Take a moment now and answer this question about foreshadowing. Which do you think is going to become the most powerful? So take a moment and pause the video and answer that question, please. As you can see here, this was the territory of the 5 patriarchs in 381 AD. And so what we can see here is we see Rome, Constantinople, Alexandria, Jerusalem, and we can see this within the context of this time. And so we can see here that the bishop of Rome becomes the most powerful, and the bishop of Constantinople becomes the second most powerful. That's prerogative of honor after the bishop of Rome. Because Constantinople is New Rome, and so the original Rome is going to be the one that we see as being the most important during this time. And so that becomes the most powerful patriarch. Constantinople is next, and then these 3 follow afterwards. So the Bishop of Rome is now named Pope. Like Papa, it is a Greek word, or excuse me, a Latin. It's the Latin word for Papa. So that's hence where we get Pope from, which becomes because Bishop of Rome is the Pope, and the Pope is then now this holiest of powers within the Catholic Church. Unifying Christianity, so establishing canon. Canon is agreed upon set of divine writings and teaching. So similar to what we have in Tanakh about understanding how to live a Jewish life and things like that. We see the same thing with canon law within Christianity, and so they chose to include some different writings and discard some others, a combination of the Old and the New Testament. And there's 2 versions of this. There's the Greek Old Testament, which has the Torah and some Greek Christian writings, and there's also the translation of Hebrew and Greek into Latin, which is the Catholic Church's official publication of the Bible. So you have these 2 separate versions of what canon law, meaning how Christians should live a Christian life. And so I want you to pause now, and I want you to hypothesize, is it problematic to have 2 different versions of law and how we should live a Christian life? So take a moment and pause the video and answer that question. Because there was a sort of a competing philosophy for how the territory should be run, Constantine decided to split up the empire in the Western Empire and the Eastern Empire into 2 sort of competing ideas of how this should be run, because that unification simply wasn't going to happen anymore. So we have a very important piece of history to discuss here in terms of the Council of Nicaea in 315, which was held by Constantine at a summer house of his in the Turkish town of Nicaea. When Constantine came to power, his territory was populated by sort of this hodgepodge of beliefs and different religions. And there's a lot of dissent within his own religion, Christianity, and the major question at the time was Jesus divine, and if so, how? There's a lot of contentious ideas happening here, and decided that in about 325 or so, that he was forced to actually sit down and discuss these ideas. And so in that summer, he decided to bring in 318 different bishops from all over this empire. Were invited to this town as vacation home, and to attempt to find some common ground on what historians consider to be this Arian controversy. The idea that how can Jesus be God and human, and how can God be the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit? So there was 2 competing philosophies happening here. This was the first worldwide gathering of the church ever. And so it's important that they discuss several ideas here. And there's two competing groups. The first being the Arians, known from Arius the preacher, that said God the Father is superior, and He created God the Son and God the Spirit. So therefore, while Jesus was a remarkable leader, He's still inferior to God, and He lacked this absolute divinity. However, Alexander, different Archbishop Alexander, not the same emperor, believed that God is one, that God and that Jesus and God are the same being. And so take a moment here, pause, and answer this question of what do you think the decision was? So what we see happening here is a very interesting compromise that was done. Constantine said, okay, we have to have a decision. We need to figure this out. And they decided that in order to make this work for both sides, here's what the compromise is going to be. That Jesus and God were of the same quote-unquote substance, leaving it purposefully vague and not getting into too much detail about the nature of that kind of relationship. The majority of the bishops agreed to this, and they passed this doctrine, known as the Nicene Creed, forming the basis for Christian ideology. They also set in stone some other rules of the church that the other future laws can be modeled after. So this decision to keep it as a compromise for what that means for Jesus and God and that kind of relationship was incredibly influential in starting Christianity. The other decision that had to be made was the date of Easter, in the sense that for so long now, because this is the holiest of Christian celebrations, Easter being the resurrection of Jesus, it was observed at different times throughout the entire empire, and they wanted to come up with one time. Now, usually in the past, it's been previously linked with the timing of Passover, so the council settled on a movable day that would never coincide with the Jewish holiday. So the first Sunday after the first full moon, on or after the spring equinox, and that would become the date for Easter. Okay, so make sure that you've taken those time to answer those questions, and be sure to come in with any question that you may have about the video. I hope you enjoyed, and we'll talk more about this in class.